She collapses in the hallway, barely conscious. The doctors find nothing wrong, but Marcus knows the truth. For 8 weeks, she's been draining her own life force every midnight, aging herself decades to save his dying daughter. The healing worked. Sophia lives. But at what cost? Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The doctors gave her 6 months. 6 months to watch his daughter fade away. 6 months to say goodbye. 6 months until the only light left in his world would go dark forever. Marcus Thorne stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, staring down at the city lights 40 stories below, and felt nothing. The diagnosis echoed in his mind like a death sentence he couldn't escape. Terminal neurological degeneration, they called it. Rare, aggressive, fatal. His daughter Sophia was 10 years old and dying, and all his billions couldn't buy her one more day than the doctors had already counted out. Marcus had built an empire from nothing. He'd started with a single tech patent and turned it into a company worth $30 billion. He'd negotiated with presidents, crushed competitors, made decisions that affected millions of lives. But none of that mattered now. None of his power, his connections, his relentless drive could save the one person who actually mattered. He'd flown Sophia to every specialist in the world. Switzerland, Tokyo, Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic. Every expert said the same thing. Her nervous system was deteriorating. Her muscles would weaken, her organs would fail, and there was nothing anyone could do but make her comfortable in the time she had left. The night they brought Sophia home from the hospital for the last time, Marcus carried her up the marble staircase of their mansion himself. She felt impossibly light in his arms, as if she was already halfway to disappearing. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale against the dark fabric of his suit. She looked up at him with those wide brown eyes that used to sparkle with mischief and adventure, but now they just looked tired. So incredibly tired. He tucked her into bed, pulling the silk sheets up to her chin, and tried to smile. She reached for his hand with fingers that trembled slightly, and he held on like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. The house felt different with Sophia home. It was a vast estate in the hills, 15 bedrooms, an indoor pool, grounds that stretched for acres. Marcus had bought it when his company went public, thinking it would be a place where Sophia could grow up with everything she needed. Now it felt like a mausoleum waiting to happen. The staff moved through the halls quietly, speaking in hushed tones, their faces carefully neutral. They all knew. Everyone knew. The household manager had already begun making arrangements for the inevitable, though no one spoke about it directly. Marcus spent his days working from home, unable to focus, but unable to stop either. He'd take calls in his office with one eye on the baby monitor he'd set up to watch Sophia's room, always waiting for the moment when something would go wrong. Sophia's room was on the second floor, overlooking the garden. Marcus had it redesigned after the diagnosis, filling it with everything she loved. Books lined the walls, her favorite stories within reach. There was a telescope by the window for the stars she used to love watching. Her art supplies sat organized on a desk she was too weak to use anymore. Everything was perfect, and everything was wrong. She spent most of her time in bed now, too exhausted to do much else. Sometimes she'd ask him to read to her, and he'd sit in the chair beside her bed and stumble through stories he could barely see through the blur of tears he wouldn't let himself shed in front of her. She deserved better than watching him fall apart. 3 weeks after Sophia came home, Marcus hired a new night nurse. The previous one had quit without explanation, and he suspected she couldn't handle watching a child die slowly. He couldn't blame her. The agency sent over someone named Keisha Williams, and Marcus barely looked at her during the interview. She was in her mid-30s, with a calm, steady presence that should have been reassuring, but just made him feel more numb. She had excellent credentials, experience with palliative care, all the right certifications. He hired her on the spot because he couldn't bring himself to care about the details anymore. He just needed someone who wouldn't quit, someone who would be there when the end came so Sophia wouldn't be alone. Keisha started that night. Marcus showed her to the staff quarters adjacent to Sophia's room, gave her a brief rundown of the medication schedule, and left her to it. He retreated to his study with a bottle of scotch and tried not to think about how many nights his daughter had left. The house was too quiet. He could hear the clock on the mantel ticking, counting down seconds that felt like they were stolen from Sophia's life. He didn't sleep anymore, not really. He'd doze in his chair and wake up in a panic, convinced something had happened, that she'd stopped breathing, that she was gone and he hadn't been there. The first week with Keisha was unremarkable. She did her job efficiently and professionally. She administered medications, monitored Sophia's vitals, kept detailed logs that Marcus couldn't bring himself to read. During the day, Sophia would sometimes have enough energy to sit up, to talk a little, but by evening she was always exhausted. Keisha would help her change into pajamas, settle her in bed, and stay in the room through the night. Marcus appreciated that she didn't try to offer false hope or empty platitudes. She treated Sophia with quiet dignity, speaking to her like she was a person, not a tragedy waiting to happen. But something strange started happening in the second week. Marcus noticed it first on a Tuesday morning. He went to check on Sophia before his first meeting of the day, expecting to find her pale and listless like she'd been every morning for months. Instead, she was sitting up in bed looking at a book, not just holding it, but actually looking at the pages with something resembling interest. Her cheeks had the faintest hint of color. It wasn't much, barely noticeable really. But after weeks of watching her fade, even the smallest change stood out. He asked her how she slept and she said fine, actually good. And that was strange too because she hadn't slept well since the symptoms started getting worse. He mentioned it to Dr. Chen, Sophia's primary physician, during their weekly call. The doctor dismissed it as normal fluctuation. Terminal patients often had good days mixed in with the bad, he explained. It didn't mean anything was changing with the underlying condition. Marcus wanted to believe him but couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Sophia seemed more alert, more present. Over the next few days, she started asking for things again. She wanted her favorite foods. She wanted to hear music. She even asked if she could sit by the window for a while to watch the garden. These were small requests, tiny signs of life, but they felt monumental after months of watching her retreat into herself. By the third week, Marcus knew something had changed. Sophia's hands weren't trembling as much when she reached for things. She could hold a glass of water without spilling it. She stayed awake longer during the day. The doctors had said she'd be bedridden by now, possibly already in the final stages of organ failure. Instead, she asked if she could try walking to the bathroom instead of using the bedpan. She made it halfway there before getting tired, but she made it. Marcus stood in the hallway watching her take those shaky steps with Keisha supporting her elbow, and he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly, because hope felt too dangerous, but something adjacent to it. He started paying more attention to what Keisha was doing. During the day, Sophia had other nurses and caretakers rotating through, but it was Keisha who stayed through the nights. Marcus began reviewing the logs more carefully, looking for anything unusual in the medications or treatments. Everything seemed standard. The same prescriptions in the same doses. Nothing had changed in the medical protocol. But Sophia was changing. She was getting stronger. It was subtle enough that Marcus questioned whether he was imagining it, whether his desperate mind was manufacturing improvements that weren't really there. But then, Dr. Chen came for a house visit and spent 20 minutes examining Sophia with increasing confusion. The doctor took Marcus aside afterward, keeping his voice low so Sophia wouldn't hear. Her vitals were better, not dramatically better, but measurably improved. Her muscle strength had increased, her tremors had decreased, her neurological responses were sharper. It didn't make sense, Dr. Chen said. The disease didn't work this way. It didn't plateau, and it certainly didn't reverse. Marcus asked what could explain it, and the doctor had no answers. Sometimes patients rallied before the end, he offered carefully. A final surge of energy before everything shut down. Marcus felt that fragile, not quite hope shatter in his chest. He nodded and thanked the doctor and saw him out, then went to his study and put his head in his hands. But the improvement continued. Another week passed, and Sophia was able to walk short distances without help. She started drawing again, her hand steady enough to control the pencil. She laughed at something on television, a real laugh that echoed through the house and made the staff pause in their work just to hear it. Marcus found himself watching her constantly, terrified that any moment she'd collapse, that this was all just a cruel illusion before the inevitable. He increased Dr. Chen's visits to twice a week. Every examination showed the same impossible thing. Sophia was getting better. Marcus cornered Keisha one evening after she'd settled Sophia for the night. He found her in the kitchen making tea, and he realized he'd barely spoken to her beyond basic logistics since she started. She looked up when he entered, her dark eyes calm and unreadable. He asked her directly what she was doing differently. What was she giving Sophia that the other nurses weren't? She looked at him for a long moment, then said she was following the care plan exactly as written. Nothing more. Nothing less. Her voice was steady, but something in her expression made him think she was choosing her words carefully. He pressed her. Sophia was improving, and that shouldn't be possible. Something had changed, and the only variable was Keisha. She maintained that she was only doing her job, but there was something in the way she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. Marcus felt frustration rising. He wasn't accusing her of anything. He just needed to understand. She finally said that sometimes patients respond better when someone takes time with them, really pays attention. Maybe Sophia was just feeling more cared for. It was a non-answer and they both knew it. Marcus let it drop, but he didn't stop watching. He started staying up later, listening. The staff quarters were near his own bedroom, and Sophia's room was just down the hall. Around midnight each night, he'd hear Keisha's soft footsteps moving from her room to Sophia's. That was normal. Part of her job was checking on Sophia throughout the night. But Marcus became aware of how long she stayed. Not just a few minutes to check vitals and adjust blankets, but extended periods, an hour, sometimes more. He told himself she was probably just sitting with Sophia, keeping watch to make sure she was breathing easy. But doubt gnawed at him. One night, Marcus couldn't take it anymore. Around 1 a.m, he heard Keisha's door open and her quiet steps heading to Sophia's room. He gave her 10 minutes, then followed. The hallway was dark except for the dim night lights along the baseboards. Sophia's door was slightly ajar, and he could see warm lamplight spilling out. He moved closer, careful not to make a sound. Through the crack in the door, he could see Keisha sitting in the chair beside Sophia's bed. She was talking softly, too quiet for him to make out words. Sophia appeared to be asleep, her breathing deep and even. Keisha's hand rested on Sophia's arm, and there was something about the gesture that seemed more than just professional monitoring. Marcus watched for 20 minutes. Keisha barely moved, just sitting there with her hand on Sophia's arm, occasionally adjusting position, but never leaving. Her lips moved occasionally like she was speaking or maybe praying. He couldn't tell. It seemed innocent enough, but Marcus felt unsettled. He retreated to his room before she could notice him. The next morning, he installed a baby monitor with a camera in Sophia's room. He told himself it was just for security, to make sure he could check on his daughter anytime. But really, he wanted to know what Keisha was doing during those long night vigils. That night, Marcus watched the monitor from his room. The image was grainy in the low light, but clear enough. Just after midnight, Keisha entered Sophia's room as usual. She checked the medical equipment, adjusted Sophia's pillows, then settled into the bedside chair. She placed both hands on Sophia's arm, just above the elbow, and closed her eyes. Marcus leaned closer to the monitor. Keisha stayed like that for over an hour, hands on Sophia's arm, eyes closed, barely moving. It looked almost like she was meditating, but there was an intensity to her stillness that felt purposeful. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the foot of the bed and looked at Sophia with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Something between hope and determination. The next morning, Sophia walked down the stairs by herself. Not quickly, and she held the railing the whole way, but she made it all the way to the breakfast room without help. Marcus stood at the bottom of the stairs watching her descend, step by careful step, and felt his world tilt. This wasn't a rally before the end. This was sustained, consistent improvement. He called Dr. Chen immediately and demanded a full workup. Every test they'd done before, he wanted done again. Blood work, brain scans, nerve conduction studies, everything. The doctor agreed, but warned Marcus not to get his hopes up. Unexplained remissions happen sometimes, but the underlying disease was still there. The tests were scheduled for the following week at the hospital. Marcus spent those days watching Sophia with growing amazement. She was playing with toys she hadn't touched in months. She was eating full meals. Her color was better, her eyes brighter. She started asking when she could go back to school, when she could see her friends again, questions that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Marcus didn't have answers. He didn't know what was happening or if it would last. All he knew was that his daughter was coming back to him, and it terrified him as much as it filled him with desperate, fragile hope. He continued watching the monitor every night. Keisha's routine never varied. Midnight visit, hands on Sophia's arm, extended period of stillness. Whatever she was doing, she did it every single night. Marcus researched everything he could think of. Alternative therapies, energy healing, faith healing, anything that might explain what he was seeing. Nothing fit. Most of it was obvious nonsense. And Keisha never brought in any equipment or supplies. She didn't chant or burn incense or do anything that looked like ritual. She just sat there with her hands on Sophia's arm like she was willing life back into her. 3 days before the hospital tests, Marcus confronted Keisha again. He found her in the garden during her afternoon break. The sun was bright and warm, and she was sitting on a bench near the roses, her face tilted up toward the light. He sat down beside her without preamble and told her he'd been watching the monitors. He knew about her midnight visits, the way she sat with Sophia for hours. He needed to know what she was doing. She turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw something crack in her professional composure. She asked if Sophia was improving, and he said yes, significantly. She nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd been hoping for. Keisha was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke carefully. She said she knew he wouldn't believe her, that most people didn't. But she came from a family where certain abilities ran in the bloodline. Not magic, nothing supernatural, just a sensitivity to the body's energy systems that most people couldn't perceive. When she touched someone, really focused on them, she could sense the places where that energy was blocked or disrupted. And sometimes, with enough time and focus, she could help clear those blockages. Let the body heal itself the way it was meant to. Marcus stared at her. She continued before he could respond. She'd been doing this with Sophia every night, trying to restore the flow of energy through her nervous system. She didn't know if it would work, especially with something as severe as Sophia's condition. But she had to try. Marcus didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to call this obvious fraud, to fire her immediately for filling his head with nonsense. But Sophia was getting better. The monitors, the tests, the medical logs, none of it explained the improvement except for one thing. Keisha. Her presence, her nighttime routine, whatever she was doing. Correlation wasn't causation, he knew that. There could be a dozen other explanations. But he looked at Keisha's face, saw the earnest hope there, and realized she believed what she was telling him. She genuinely thought she was healing his daughter. He asked why she hadn't said anything before. She looked away, back toward the house where Sophia was probably napping. She said people like him didn't believe in people like her, until they had no other choice. She'd learned it was better to just do the work quietly, and let the results speak for themselves. He let her go back to her work without saying whether he believed her or not. Because honestly, he didn't know. It sounded like exactly the kind of desperate magical thinking that preyed on dying people and their families. But Sophia was improving. That was undeniable. The hospital tests would tell them more. Maybe they'd find something the previous scans missed. Some explanation that made medical sense. Maybe this was just a bizarre coincidence. Sophia's body mounting some unexpected immune response at the exact same time Keisha started her nighttime routine. Or maybe, impossibly, Keisha was actually doing something that the entire medical establishment said was impossible. That night Marcus didn't just watch the monitor. He went to Sophia's room and stood in the doorway where Keisha couldn't see him. She was in her usual position, hands on Sophia's arm, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. Marcus watched for over an hour. He tried to see what she was seeing, feel what she was feeling. There was nothing visible happening. No light, no energy, nothing he could perceive. Just a woman sitting very still, touching her daughter's arm. It should have looked ridiculous, Instead, it looked like the most intense act of focus and will he'd ever witnessed. Keisha's face was serene, but sweat beaded her forehead. Her hands trembled slightly. Whatever she was doing, it clearly took effort. When Keisha finally left Sophia's room that night, Marcus followed her. She startled when she found him waiting in the hallway, hand going to her chest. He apologized for scaring her, and then asked if he could watch her work. Not secretly through a monitor, but actually be in the room to see what she was doing. She hesitated, then nodded. She said she'd been hoping he'd ask, that it might help if he understood. They went back into Sophia's room together. Marcus pulled up a second chair while Keisha took her usual position. She asked him to be quiet, to try not to let his skepticism interfere, and then she closed her eyes and placed her hands on Sophia's arm. Marcus watched. For the first 30 minutes, nothing happened that he could see. Keisha sat very still, breathing deeply, her hands warm against Sophia's skin. Then Marcus noticed something, or thought he did. It was so subtle he wasn't sure if his eyes were playing tricks in the dim lamplight, but Sophia's breathing seemed to deepen, become more rhythmic. The slight tension that was always visible in her small body seemed to ease. It could have been normal sleep patterns, or it could have been a response to whatever Keisha was doing. Marcus kept watching, trying to stay objective, trying not to project his desperate hopes onto what he was seeing. After an hour, Keisha opened her eyes and slowly withdrew her hands. She looked exhausted, more so than Marcus had seen her before. He asked what she felt, and she tried to explain. She said Sophia's energy pathways were damaged, like wires that had been frayed and tangled. Every night she worked to smooth them out, strengthen them, help the signals flow properly again. Some nights she could feel improvement, the pathways responding and beginning to heal. Other nights it felt like pushing against a wall. She never knew if it was working until the next day when she saw how Sophia was doing. Marcus asked if it was painful for her, this process. Keisha shook her head. Just tiring. It took everything she had to maintain that level of focus for so long. The day of the hospital tests arrived. Marcus drove Sophia himself, with Keisha accompanying them in case Sophia needed anything. Sophia chattered the whole way, excited to be out of the house, pointing at things outside the window. She asked if they could get ice cream after the tests, and Marcus said yes, absolutely, whatever she wanted. At the hospital, technicians ran Sophia through scan after scan. Marcus paced the waiting rooms, unable to sit still. Keisha sat calmly reading a magazine, but he noticed she never turned the pages. She was just as nervous as he was, but better at hiding it. Dr. Chen called them into his office 3 hours later. He had Sophia's scans pulled up on his computer screen, comparing them to the ones from 8 weeks ago. Marcus could see the confusion on the doctor's face before he even started speaking. The neurological degeneration had stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped completely. And in some areas, there appeared to be regeneration. New neural pathways forming where old ones had died. The doctor kept saying it was unprecedented, that he'd never seen anything like this. He wanted to send the scans to specialists, get second opinions, but the evidence was right there. Sophia's nervous system was healing itself. Marcus asked what could cause this, and Dr. Chen had no idea. Spontaneous remission was theoretically possible, but this wasn't just remission. This was active regeneration. They left the hospital in a daze. Sophia got her ice cream, oblivious to the miracle that was happening inside her body. She asked Marcus why he kept staring at her, and he said he just liked looking at her. Which was true. He couldn't stop staring. Couldn't believe she was here, and healthy, and eating chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream like a normal kid. Keisha caught his eye over Sophia's head and gave him the smallest smile. He realized in that moment that he believed her. Whatever she was doing, however impossible it seemed, it was working. His daughter was healing and Keisha was somehow, impossibly, the reason why. Back at the mansion, Marcus's mind raced with possibilities and questions. If Keisha could heal Sophia, who else could she help? How did this ability work? Why didn't more people know about it? That evening, after Sophia was settled in bed, he asked Keisha to meet him in his study. She came hesitantly, still maintaining that professional distance she'd held since day one. He poured them both a scotch and gestured for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the leather chair like she might need to bolt at any moment. He told her he believed her now, about what she could do. He'd seen the scans. There was no medical explanation for Sophia's recovery. She was the only variable that made sense. Keisha took a careful sip of her drink, and then told him the rest of it. The ability ran in her family, passed down through generations. Her grandmother had it, used it to help people in their community who couldn't afford doctors. But it came with a cost. The healing took a toll on the healer. Energy had to come from somewhere, and what she was doing was channeling her own life force into Sophia to help her body repair itself. She'd known from the start that healing someone as damaged as Sophia would drain her significantly, but she'd seen the case file, known Sophia was dying, and decided it was worth it, even if it meant shortening her own life to save a child's. Marcus felt his breath catch. He asked how much it was costing her, this nightly healing. Keisha shrugged like it didn't matter. Years, probably. She didn't know exactly. Every person was different. Every healing took a different toll. But Sophia was young and her body was fighting hard to survive. That made the healing easier, more effective. With enough time, maybe another month of nightly sessions, Keisha thought Sophia could fully recover. Her nervous system could completely regenerate. She'd live a normal life, grow up, have everything that had been stolen from her by disease. Marcus asked at what cost to Keisha. She met his eyes steadily and said whatever it took. He wanted to tell her to stop, that he couldn't let her sacrifice herself for his daughter. But the words stuck in his throat, because the truth was, he didn't want her to stop. Sophia was his entire world, and if Keisha was willing to give up years of her life to save her, who was he to refuse? The selfish part of him, the part that would do anything for his daughter, wanted to let Keisha continue without question. But the part of him that was still human, still capable of caring about someone beyond his own blood, couldn't accept that cost. He told Keisha there had to be another way, some way to help Sophia without destroying herself in the process. Keisha explained that healing wasn't like flipping a switch. It required sustained effort, consistent energy transfer over time. Shortcuts didn't exist. But maybe, she suggested carefully, if Marcus helped, if he learned to focus his own energy, he could share some of the burden. It wouldn't be as effective as if Keisha did it alone. She was trained and experienced. But it might mean the healing could continue without draining her quite so completely. Marcus asked if she could teach him. She said she could try, but most people couldn't develop the sensitivity needed. It took years of practice, meditation, learning to perceive the energy that most people remain blind to their entire lives. They started that night. After Sophia fell asleep, Keisha had Marcus sit beside her at Sophia's bedside. She guided his hand to rest on Sophia's other arm and told him to close his eyes, breathe deeply, and try to feel beyond the physical. Let go of thought, of logic, of everything his rational mind told him was possible. Just feel. Marcus tried. He sat there breathing, hands on his daughter's arm, trying to sense something beyond warm skin and a slow pulse. Nothing happened. He felt ridiculous, like he was play-acting at something he didn't understand. But Keisha was patient. She told him to keep trying, come back tomorrow night and the night after. Learning to perceive energy was like developing any other sense. It took time and practice. Marcus showed up the next night, and the night after that. Each time he sat beside Keisha, placed his hands on Sophia, and tried to feel what she felt. The first week, he sensed nothing, just his imagination running wild, his desperate brain inventing sensations that weren't there. But he kept coming back because Sophia kept improving. She was walking longer distances now, her stamina increasing daily. She started talking about going back to school, seeing her friends, doing normal kid things. Dr. Chen was baffled, but cautiously optimistic. Whatever was happening, he wanted it to continue. He increased Sophia's vitamin regimen and physical therapy, but privately admitted to Marcus that nothing in the medical protocol explained the dramatic improvement. During the second week of practice, Marcus thought he felt something. A warmth that seemed to come from inside Sophia rather than just her skin temperature. A subtle vibration, like a current running beneath the surface. He mentioned it to Keisha, and she encouraged him. That was the beginning, she said. That sense of inner warmth and movement. Over time, he'd learned to distinguish between healthy energy flow and the disrupted, damaged areas. He'd learned to direct his own energy into those damaged spaces, helping them heal. It sounded impossible, but Marcus had stopped questioning what was possible. His daughter was alive and getting stronger. That was all that mattered. The nighttime sessions became a routine. Marcus would finish his work, have dinner with Sophia, read her a story, and then return after she fell asleep to sit with Keisha and practice. They rarely talked during these sessions. Words felt intrusive, breaking the concentration needed. But afterward they'd sometimes sit together for a few minutes, discussing what Marcus had felt, or thought he'd felt. Keisha would explain how energy worked, how the body's systems were all interconnected, how disease was often just a disruption in the natural flow that the body wanted to correct if given the chance. Marcus absorbed it all, this worldview so different from everything he'd been taught. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to sense more. He could feel the areas of Sophia's nervous system that were still damaged, perceived them as spots of coldness, or static in the otherwise warming flow. He learned to direct his attention to those areas, imagining warmth and healing flowing from his hands into her body. He had no idea if he was actually doing anything or just engaging in elaborate visualization, but Keisha insisted it was helping, that she could feel his contribution, that the healing was progressing faster than she'd managed alone. And Sophia continued to improve, growing stronger and more vibrant every day. Marcus noticed changes in Keisha too. She looked tired more often, shadows under her eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide. She moved a little slower, like her energy had been siphoned away. He asked repeatedly if she was okay, and she always said yes, just tired. Nothing to worry about. But he worried anyway. He'd grown to care about her beyond her role as Sophia's healer. She was intelligent, compassionate, dedicated. They'd spent so many quiet hours together in Sophia's room that he felt he knew her better than people he'd known for years. She'd told him about growing up in Atlanta, about her grandmother teaching her to sense and direct energy from the time she was 6 years old, about the community of healers her family was part of, people who kept their abilities quiet because the world wasn't ready to accept what they could do. One night, about 6 weeks into treatment, Marcus felt something shift during the healing session. The cold spots in Sophia's energy flow suddenly warmed, like ice cracking and breaking under spring sun. He opened his eyes to find Keisha staring at him with something like awe on her face. She whispered that he'd done it, actually moved energy into Sophia's nervous system, helped bridge a damaged connection. He felt a surge of triumph and hope. If he could do that, truly help with the healing, then maybe Keisha wouldn't have to sacrifice as much of herself. Maybe they could save Sophia without destroying Keisha in the process. The healing sessions intensified after that. Marcus was there every night, working alongside Keisha to repair Sophia's nervous system. He could feel it happening now. The gradual knitting together of damaged pathways, the strengthening of connections that had been dying. It was exhausting work that left him drained and shaky afterward, but he kept at it. Sophia was so close to being fully healed. Dr. Chen had said if her improvement continued at this rate, she'd be off all medications within a month, could return to school, could live a completely normal life. The 6-month death sentence had been overturned by something the medical establishment said was impossible, but the cost was becoming visible. Keisha was fading. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging looser on her frame. Her hands shook sometimes, and twice Marcus found her gripping the hallway wall like she needed support to stay upright. When he confronted her, she admitted the healing was taking more than she'd anticipated. Sophia's nervous system had been so damaged that repairing it required enormous amounts of energy. Even with Marcus helping, Keisha was bearing the brunt of the work because she was more skilled, more efficient at directing healing energy. She promised she could last long enough to see Sophia fully recovered. After that she'd rest, recover what she could, accept what she couldn't. Marcus made a decision. He told Keisha he was going to learn everything she could teach him, as fast as possible. He'd take over more of the healing work, spare her what he could. She protested that he wasn't ready, that rushing the learning process could be dangerous. But he didn't care. She'd given up years of her life for his daughter, a child who wasn't even hers. The least he could do was match her sacrifice. They increased the practice sessions, Keisha teaching him techniques her grandmother had taught her, ways to draw on his own life energy, and direct it with precision and power. Marcus threw himself into learning with the same intensity he'd once applied to building his business empire. Every night he practiced, pushing himself to sense more, do more, bear more of the healing burden. He started to understand what Keisha meant about the cost. After intense healing sessions, he'd feel hollow, like something essential had been scooped out of him, his own energy reserves depleting as he poured them into his daughter. But seeing Sophia laugh and play and live made every bit of exhaustion worthwhile. She was going to survive. She was going to have a future. That was all that mattered. 7 weeks into treatment, Dr. Chen declared Sophia's recovery complete. The scans showed full neural regeneration. Her nervous system was functioning normally. Every test came back perfect. He called it a medical miracle, admitted he had no explanation, but couldn't argue with results. Sophia was healthy. Marcus held his daughter that night and cried for the first time since her diagnosis, great heaving sobs of relief and gratitude. She hugged him back, confused but comforting, telling him it was okay, she was fine now. Everything was fine. And she was right. Everything was fine except for Keisha. Marcus found her collapsed in her room the next morning. She'd made it through Sophia's full recovery but had nothing left. He called for an ambulance, rode with her to the hospital, demanded the best doctors. They ran tests and found nothing medically wrong, but she was weak, barely conscious. They gave her IV fluids, vitamins, monitored her vitals. The doctor said she seemed exhausted, like someone who'd run multiple marathons without rest. They wanted to keep her for observation, try to figure out what had depleted her so severely. Marcus stayed by her bedside, holding her hand, telling her Sophia was healed. It was done. She'd succeeded. Keisha opened her eyes after 2 days. She looked at Marcus and smiled weakly. Asked how Sophia was doing. He said perfect, completely healthy, asking when Keisha was coming home. She'd become part of their family without either of them quite acknowledging it. Keisha said she just needed rest, that her body would recover given time. But Marcus could see the truth in her eyes. She'd given up years, maybe decades, to save his daughter. The doctors released her after a week with instructions to rest and follow up if symptoms persisted. Marcus brought her back to the mansion, had the staff prepare a suite for her, insisted she stay as long as she needed. Sophia was overjoyed to see Keisha again. She'd been worried, asking every day when her night nurse was coming back. She hugged Keisha carefully, already sensing she needed to be gentle. Sophia didn't know about the healing, didn't understand that Keisha had saved her life through means that defied medical explanation. She just knew that Keisha had been there through the worst time, had made her feel safe and cared for. Marcus watched them together and felt something shift in his chest. Keisha had become important to both of them, essential even. The thought of her leaving felt wrong. Over the following weeks, Keisha slowly regained her strength. She moved back into the routine of the house, but her role had changed. She wasn't Sophia's nurse anymore because Sophia didn't need nursing. She was something else, something harder to define. Companion, friend, healer who'd sacrificed everything. Marcus found himself seeking her out during the day, wanting to share news about Sophia's progress, about the business, about anything. They'd have coffee together in the morning, take walks through the garden in the evening. Sophia would often join them, chattering about school and friends and all the things she'd missed during her illness. Marcus realized he'd fallen in love with Keisha somewhere between those midnight healing sessions and her collapse from exhaustion. Not because she'd saved Sophia, though that was part of it, but because of who she was, her strength, her compassion, her willingness to give everything for someone else's child. The quiet way she'd integrated into their lives, making the vast mansion feel like an actual home instead of a mausoleum. He didn't know how to tell her, wasn't sure if she'd want to hear it. She'd been hired to do a job, had completed it at enormous personal cost. She didn't owe them anything more, but Keisha stayed. Weeks became months, and she showed no signs of leaving. Her strength returned gradually, though Marcus suspected she'd never be quite as strong as before. She'd aged herself healing Sophia, though it wasn't visible in lines or gray hair. It was something deeper, a fundamental depletion that time alone couldn't fully restore. When Marcus asked if she had anywhere else to go, anyone waiting for her, she shook her head. Her family was spread across the country, living their own lives. She'd been working as a traveling nurse, going where she was needed. She didn't have a home base anymore. Marcus suggested she could stay, not as an employee, but as family. Sophia needed her, he said. Which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he needed her presence, her calm strength, the way she'd taught him to see the world differently. She looked at him carefully, those dark eyes reading something in his face. She said she'd stay, but only if she could find a new purpose. She couldn't just sit idle. It wasn't in her nature. Marcus asked what she wanted to do, and she said she wanted to help other people the way she'd helped Sophia. They started small. Keisha began seeing patients, people who'd exhausted medical options, and were desperate enough to try anything. Marcus referred them discreetly, people from his business network whose children or spouses were facing terminal diagnoses. Keisha would work with them, sometimes seeing improvement, sometimes not. She was careful never to promise outcomes, never to take money from desperate families. She did it because she could, because the ability to heal shouldn't be hoarded. Marcus supported her work, providing space in the mansion, handling logistics, making sure she didn't overtax herself. Word spread quietly through certain circles. The healer who'd saved Marcus Thorne's daughter. Desperate people started reaching out, begging for help. Keisha couldn't take everyone. She wasn't strong enough for that anymore. She selected cases carefully, focusing on children mostly. People young enough that healing might truly change the trajectory of their lives. Marcus watched her work and marveled at her dedication. She'd given years of her life to save Sophia, and now she was giving what remained of her strength to save others. Sophia thrived. She returned to school, made friends, joined clubs. She was a normal 10-year-old with no memory of the death sentence that had once hung over her. Sometimes Marcus would watch her playing in the garden, racing around with boundless energy, and remember how close he'd come to losing her. Those moments hit him like a physical blow, the gratitude and relief and residual fear all tangled together. Keisha would often be beside him during these moments, watching Sophia with her own quiet satisfaction. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew what a miracle looked like. One evening, about 8 months after Sophia's recovery, Marcus finally told Keisha he loved her. They were in the garden at sunset, Sophia visible through the window doing homework at the kitchen table. Keisha had been describing a new patient, a young boy with a degenerative muscle disease, and Marcus had been only half listening because he was too busy looking at her. The way the fading light caught her face, the animation in her voice as she talked about healing, the strength that remained in her despite everything she'd given up. He interrupted her mid-sentence and told her he was in love with her, had been for months, needed her to know. She went quiet, surprise flickering across her features. Then she smiled, that slow, warm smile that had become familiar over the months. She told him she loved him too, had known for a while but hadn't wanted to presume. She'd been hired as staff, had crossed so many boundaries already. Adding a relationship to that seemed like it might be taking advantage. Marcus laughed at that, the idea that she could be taking advantage when she'd literally given up years of her life for them. He pulled her close and kissed her while the sunset painted the garden gold around them. Sophia was delighted when they told her. She'd been hoping they'd figure it out, she said, with the knowing tone of a child who sees more than adults give her credit for. She asked if this meant Keisha would stay forever, and they both said yes. The three of them became a family in the official way, not just the found family they'd already created. Marcus and Keisha married quietly a year after Sophia's recovery, a small ceremony in the garden with Sophia as the flower girl. It felt right in a way Marcus hadn't known to hope for. He'd expected to spend the rest of his life grieving his daughter. Instead, he'd found a whole new life he hadn't known was possible. They turned part of the mansion into a healing center. Keisha trained other people who showed the sensitivity, building a small team of healers who could work with patients. It wasn't enough to help everyone. The need was too great and healers too rare. But they helped who they could, focusing on cases that traditional medicine had given up on. Some improved dramatically, like Sophia. Others saw modest gains or none at all. Healing wasn't a guaranteed miracle, Keisha always explained. It depended on the patient's body, the nature of the disease, 100 factors they didn't fully understand. But trying was better than accepting defeat. Marcus's perspective on life had fundamentally changed. He'd spent years chasing success, building an empire, accumulating wealth and power. None of it had mattered when Sophia was dying. None of it could have saved her. What saved her was Keisha's willingness to sacrifice, to give of herself without guarantee of success. That lesson stayed with him. He started redirecting his wealth toward causes that actually mattered. Medical research, support for families facing terminal illnesses, programs to help people access care they couldn't afford. He'd never be able to repay what Keisha had done, but he could try to honor it by helping others. Dr. Chen remained baffled by Sophia's recovery, but eventually accepted it as one of those medical mysteries that defied explanation. He published a paper on her case, carefully worded to avoid claims he couldn't substantiate. Spontaneous regeneration of neural tissue in a terminal patient. Other doctors were skeptical but couldn't argue with the scans. Sophia became a case study, proof that the body could sometimes heal in ways science didn't yet understand. Marcus and Keisha never told the full truth. Some things they agreed. The world wasn't ready to hear. Sophia grew up healthy and strong. She remembered being sick, remembered feeling weak and scared. But those memories faded over time the way childhood trauma did. She remembered Keisha being there, being kind, making her feel safe. That was enough. When she got older and Marcus finally told her the truth about what Keisha had done, how she'd healed her through methods that defied medical science, Sophia wasn't surprised. She'd always known Keisha was special, that the recovery had been more than luck. She hugged Keisha fiercely and promised to honor the gift she'd been given by living fully, by making her extended life matter. Years passed. Sophia graduated from high school with honors, planning to study medicine because she wanted to help people the way she'd been helped. She'd never be able to do what Keisha did. She didn't have that sensitivity, but she could work with conventional medicine to push the boundaries of what was possible. Marcus supported her dreams while building his own legacy with Keisha. They'd helped hundreds of patients through the healing center, some dramatically, others in small ways that still mattered. Each success felt like a validation of Keisha's sacrifice, proof that what she'd given up for Sophia had rippled outward to touch countless other lives. Keisha's strength never fully returned to what it had been before healing Sophia. She'd aged herself by decades in those 8 weeks of intensive treatment. Marcus saw it sometimes in the way she moved, slower than she should at her age, more carefully. She never complained, considered it a fair trade, one person's years for another person's lifetime. But Marcus grieved for what she'd lost, even as he cherished what they'd gained. He made sure she rested, took care of herself, didn't overtax what remained of her abilities. She was too important, too precious to risk. On the 10-year anniversary of Sophia's recovery, they held a celebration in the garden where Marcus and Keisha had married. Sophia was 20 now, in her second year of medical school, brilliant and compassionate, and everything they'd hoped she'd become. She made a toast, thanking Keisha for the life she'd given back, promising to spend it helping others. Marcus looked around at the gathering, friends and healed patients and staff who'd become family. This life, this full, beautiful life, had seemed impossible a decade ago. But Keisha had made it possible, one midnight healing session at a time. Marcus took Keisha's hand under the table, lacing their fingers together. She squeezed back, that silent communication they'd developed over years together. They'd both sacrificed for this family, this life. Marcus had learned that some things mattered more than money, or power, or control. Love mattered. Hope mattered. The willingness to give of yourself for someone else mattered most of all. Keisha had taught him that through her actions, not just for Sophia, but for every patient she'd helped since. The medical establishment still didn't recognize what Keisha could do. They called it placebo effect, spontaneous remission, unexplained recovery. Fine, Marcus thought. Let them have their explanations that let them sleep at night. He knew the truth. He'd felt it himself, the energy flowing through his hands into Sophia's damaged nervous system, the warmth of healing that defied scientific measurement. Some truths didn't need validation from authorities. They just needed to be lived and honored and passed on to those ready to receive them. Sophia started showing signs of the sensitivity in her late teens. Nothing as strong as Keisha's ability, but a flicker of awareness, a sense of the energy that flowed through living things. Keisha began teaching her, carefully, never pushing but guiding when Sophia expressed interest. Maybe she'd never be a healer like Keisha, but she'd have tools that would make her a better doctor, more attuned to her patients beyond just symptoms and test results. Another legacy of that desperate midnight routine 10 years ago. Marcus thought often about those 6 months the doctors had given Sophia. 6 months that had stretched into years, into a decade, into a full life still unfolding. All because one woman had been willing to sacrifice her own years to save a stranger's child. He'd spent his whole life before Sophia's illness thinking he understood what mattered, what had value. He'd been wrong about everything that counted. Keisha had taught him to see differently, to value what couldn't be measured on a balance sheet or quantified in market metrics. The healing center continued to grow. They'd helped establish similar centers in other cities, training people who showed the sensitivity, creating a quiet network of healers who worked outside mainstream medicine. It would never be accepted by the establishment, might never be. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that desperate families had somewhere to turn when traditional medicine offered no hope. Sometimes healing worked, sometimes it didn't. But having the option, having someone willing to try, that alone was valuable. Marcus had stopped asking what it cost Keisha to save Sophia. He'd learned the answer wasn't simple. Yes, she'd aged herself, shortened her own life by years or decades. But she'd also gained a family, a purpose, a legacy that would outlive her physical years. She'd proven that healing was possible, inspired others to develop their own abilities, created ripples that would continue long after she was gone. When he looked at it that way, the cost seemed less like sacrifice, and more like investment in a future she'd helped create. On quiet evenings, Marcus and Keisha would sit in the garden watching the sunset, Sophia's laughter drifting from somewhere in the house. These moments felt sacred, stolen from a timeline where Sophia had died, and Marcus had spent the rest of his life grieving. Instead, they had this: love, family, purpose, hope. All because one night nurse had been willing to do what everyone else said was impossible. Marcus had learned that impossible just meant no one had tried hard enough yet. That sometimes you had to look beyond what science could measure to find what actually healed. The years continued to unfold. When Sophia turned 25, she completed her medical residency and joined a pediatric neurology practice. Her first patient was a 7-year-old girl with symptoms similar to what she'd experienced. Sophia called Marcus that night, voice shaking, and asked if Keisha would see her. Keisha agreed without hesitation, though her abilities had weakened over the years. The little girl was named Maya. It took 6 months, but with Marcus, Sophia, and Keisha working together, sharing the burden, Maya recovered enough to live a relatively normal life. Her parents offered everything they had in payment. Marcus refused. This was about paying forward the miracle they'd received. Maya's case opened a new chapter in their work. Sophia began identifying patients who might benefit from energy healing, referring them discreetly to Keisha. Marcus watched Keisha age faster than she should, the accumulated cost of years of healing work showing in ways that broke his heart. She moved more slowly now, needed more rest. The years she'd given to Sophia and hundreds of others had extracted their toll. She never complained, considered every healed patient worth whatever it cost her. Sophia met James during her residency, a fellow doctor who worked in oncology. He was kind and passionate, and when Sophia told him about Keisha's healing work, he was fascinated rather than skeptical. They married in the same garden where Marcus and Keisha had wed. 2 years later, Sophia announced she was pregnant. The news terrified and thrilled her. What if her child inherited the disease? Dr. Chen found no hereditary markers, but there were no guarantees. Her daughter was born healthy and perfect. They named her Keisha, after the woman who'd made this entire impossible lineage possible. Marcus held his granddaughter and wept openly. Young Keisha grew up surrounded by stories of healing and hope. As she got older, she showed signs of the sensitivity too, stronger than Sophia's. Grandmother Keisha began teaching her granddaughter when she was 8, passing on healing techniques that would continue after she was gone. Marcus was 70 now, his movement slowed by age. He'd lived a longer, fuller life than he'd imagined possible. Every morning he woke up next to Keisha and felt grateful. The healing center had expanded into a research foundation, working with open-minded scientists willing to study energy healing. The research was slow, but progress was happening. Papers were being published. More doctors were becoming curious rather than skeptical. Keisha's health declined noticeably in her mid-60s. The cumulative toll of decades of healing work had weakened her beyond what rest could repair. She'd given too much of herself, poured too many years into other people's healing. Marcus wanted to rage against it, to demand she stop. But he'd learned he couldn't protect her from her own choices. She knew what healing cost, had always known, and chose to pay that price anyway. All he could do was love her and make sure she spent her remaining time surrounded by the family she'd created. Young Keisha was 15 when her grandmother sat her down for a serious conversation in the garden. Grandmother Keisha explained that she wouldn't live much longer, that the healing work had aged her body beyond what it could sustain. But she wasn't afraid. She'd lived a life of purpose, had saved countless people, had built a family from love and sacrifice. She had no regrets. What mattered now was passing on everything she knew, making sure the healing work would continue. The lessons intensified over the following months. Grandmother Keisha taught young Keisha everything, techniques she'd never shared with anyone else, deep secrets of energy healing her own grandmother had passed to her. She taught not just how to heal, but why, the philosophy behind the work. Healing wasn't about playing God or defying death. It was about giving people a chance, honoring the body's desire to repair itself, about love made manifest through willingness to sacrifice for others. Grandmother Keisha died quietly in her sleep 2 weeks after her 67th birthday. She'd aged herself by perhaps 30 years through her healing work, trading her own longevity for other people's lives. Marcus found her in the morning, peaceful and still, finally at rest after decades of giving everything she had. He sat beside her body for an hour, holding her hand, saying goodbye to the woman who'd saved his daughter and changed his life, and taught him what actually mattered. When Sophia and young Keisha arrived, they held each other and cried together, mourning the loss while honoring everything she'd given them. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, patients she'd healed, families she'd helped, healers she'd trained, doctors who'd learned from her that medicine extended beyond what their textbooks taught. Each person had a story about how Keisha had changed their life, given them hope when they had none, shown them that impossible just meant difficult. Marcus listened to story after story and felt a bittersweet pride. She'd lived a shorter life than she should have, but she'd lived it so fully, so purposefully, that it counted for more than most people managed in twice the years. Her legacy wasn't measured in length, but in depth and impact. Young Keisha took up her grandmother's work with fierce dedication. At just 16, she was already seeing patients, carefully applying the techniques she'd learned. She had the power her grandmother had possessed, maybe even more, and she used it with the same selfless commitment. Marcus worried about her, about the cost she'd eventually pay. But Sophia reminded him that this was young Keisha's choice. They couldn't protect her from her own calling any more than they'd been able to protect grandmother Keisha. All they could do was support her, make sure she didn't give too much too fast, help her find balance between healing others and preserving herself. Sophia and James had 2 more children over the years, both healthy, both carrying traces of the healing sensitivity. The family legacy was expanding, creating a new generation of healers who could continue the work. Marcus watched his grandchildren grow and marveled at how his life had turned out. He'd started as a ruthless businessman who measured worth in dollars and power. He'd been transformed by loss and saved by an improbable healing. Now he was the patriarch of a family dedicated to helping others. His greatest legacy, not the billions he'd made, but the people he'd helped save through supporting Keisha's work. Money could buy many things, but it couldn't buy what Keisha had given them. That came only through sacrifice and love. On what would have been grandmother Keisha's 70th birthday, the family gathered in the garden. They'd planted a tree there in her memory, a strong oak that would outlive them all, its roots deep and its branches reaching toward the sky like the legacy she'd created. Marcus stood with Sophia on one side and young Keisha on the other, surrounded by his grandchildren and the extended family of healers and healed patients that had grown from one woman's sacrifice. He thought about that desperate night 25 years ago, when Sophia had 6 months to live and no hope. How Keisha had walked into their lives and changed everything, not through medicine or money or power, but through the simple, profound act of giving herself for someone else's child. She'd taught them all that true strength wasn't about what you could take or accumulate, but about what you were willing to give. Young Keisha, now 21, and in medical school like her mother, had taken on the role of primary healer at the foundation. She worked with a team of other sensitive healers, distributing the work so no one person had to sacrifice everything like grandmother Keisha had. They were learning, evolving, finding ways to heal more efficiently, to protect healers while helping patients. It would never be perfect. There would always be a cost, but they were making progress in understanding how to minimize that cost while maximizing benefit. Marcus was 75 when he felt his own health beginning to fail. Not disease or dramatic illness, just the accumulation of years, the normal wearing down of a body that had lived a long, full life. He found himself thinking more about endings, about legacy, about what would remain after he was gone. He'd built a billion-dollar company, but that seemed insignificant now. What mattered was the healing foundation, the family he'd built with Keisha, the hundreds of lives that had been saved or improved, because one woman had been willing to sacrifice for his daughter. Sophia was running the foundation now, combining her medical expertise with the healing knowledge she'd learned from Keisha. She'd become a bridge between conventional medicine and energy healing, earning respect in both worlds through careful research and documentation. She published papers documenting cases of unexplained recovery, building a scientific case for phenomena that science couldn't yet fully explain. Some colleagues dismissed her work as pseudoscience, but others were intrigued, willing to consider that medicine might extend beyond what they currently understood. She was patient, knowing that changing minds and opening doors took time. Each small victory, each doctor who became curious instead of dismissive, represented progress toward a future where healing wouldn't be divided into conventional and alternative, but would be recognized as a spectrum of approaches all aimed at the same goal. On Marcus's 76th birthday, young Keisha asked if she could try something. She wanted to heal him, to give back some of what her grandmother had given to their family. Marcus protested at first. He was old and his time was naturally coming to an end. She shouldn't sacrifice her years for his. But she insisted, not to extend his life indefinitely or cheat death, just to ease his pain and improve his quality of life, give him a few more comfortable years with his family. He finally agreed, unable to refuse her earnest desire to help. She reminded him so much of her grandmother in that moment, the same determination to heal regardless of personal cost. The healing sessions were gentle, nothing like the intensive work grandmother Keisha had done with Sophia. Young Keisha worked carefully, easing Marcus's arthritis, improving his energy, helping his body function more efficiently without overtaxing herself. She'd learned from her grandmother's mistakes, understood that healing required balance, that you couldn't pour out everything you had without keeping something back for yourself. He felt better, stronger, more present. Not young again. He was still an old man who'd lived a full life, but a healthier one with less pain and more capacity to enjoy his remaining time with the family he loved. He understood now what healing felt like from the receiving end. The warmth that seemed to come from inside, the sense of things settling into right alignment. The gentle return of vitality he'd thought was gone forever. It was the gift grandmother Keisha had given Sophia all those years ago, now flowing forward to touch another generation, creating an unbroken chain of care and compassion. Marcus lived to see his 80th birthday, surrounded by 3 generations of family in the garden, where so much of their story had unfolded. He looked around at the faces he loved. Sophia strong and brilliant in her role as foundation director, young Keisha dedicated and powerful in her healing work, his other grandchildren growing into their own gifts and passions. All of this, every bit of it, had stemmed from one impossible night when a hired nurse decided to do what doctors said couldn't be done. Grandmother Keisha had saved Sophia, and in saving her, had saved them all, had created this entire legacy of love and healing and purpose that would continue long after any of them were gone. The ripples of her sacrifice extended further than anyone could have imagined. As the sun set over the garden and his family laughed and talked around him, Marcus felt complete. He'd lived a longer, fuller life than he'd imagined possible. He'd learned what actually mattered, not the billions, or the power, or the success he'd once pursued so relentlessly, but the love, the sacrifice, the willingness to give of yourself for others. Grandmother Keisha had taught him that through her actions, saving a dying child at great personal cost, and he'd spent the rest of his life trying to honor that lesson by supporting the healing work and helping others find hope in desperate circumstances. When his time came, he would go peacefully, knowing that Sophia had lived, that she'd built a family and a career helping others, that the healing work continued through young Keisha and would continue for generations to come. That impossible just meant nobody had tried hard enough yet. Some legacies were measured in dollars and buildings and business empires, but the best ones, the ones that truly mattered and would echo across time, were measured in lives saved and love multiplied across generations, in the quiet moments of sacrifice that changed everything. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.